I think you said 79,000 children per day in Texas alone, where we
Texas
are now.
alone.
So what does that mean exactly? It's explain that number to me, and then tell me a little bit about sort of nationally. Yeah.
That number means in any given day, there's 79,000 children in the state of Texas that are in the system of being sexually exploited. Does it mean all 79,000 that day had to, against their will, give sex for safety, security, whatever? No, nobody would know. But there's 79,000, and this is a Ken Paxton, Attorney General of Texas number. Our number in the industry is higher than that. But we're going to go with a number that the AG's office publishes, right? So think about that for a second. You got 79,000. I live by the notion that one is too many. That's the state of Texas. We have over 500,000 kids in America that's in that situation today. And here's a stat for you. Only 1% of the crime is reported. And we have those numbers. When you see an Amber Alert, for instance, that's 1%, right? Because victims don't self-identify as victims, Jan. And we're not just a talking head, talking politics. We're on the ground. We're working with the families. I was in a field a number of weeks ago looking for a body. We are there. We know what families go through. We understand the horrific reality of this crime, right? It's real to people. But victims don't identify as victims. They learn that they were victimized because it's a programming, it's an indoctrination, it's a lifestyle, it's an acceptance of this is my value, this is my contribution to this family, whether it's a artificial family or a real family, right? So it's a very, very difficult fight to fight. But yeah, 79,000 per day in Texas.
Something that recently happened, actually, that maybe a lot of the country is aware of, there was this Operation Not Forgotten. I think almost 20 children were rescued. You were somehow involved in this, right?
Yeah, yes, and so many nonprofits are involved, always working with law enforcement. And what people to know is law enforcement cannot do this by themselves. They just physically don't have the resources on the what we call on the street or on the track. And so, yes, involved. A lot of apprehensions, a lot of rescues. A lot of those are active cases going on at the moment. But there were a number of those operations, and they really stemmed from a White House that signed an executive order to say, look, interdepartment agencies have to communicate. So it released the U.S. Marshal Service that was very involved there, and ICE and the FBI to collaborate with local law enforcement, police departments, because the strange occurrence is that they don't communicate. They don't share cases, yet the traffic victims are transient. They're being moved throughout the country. So if you build a case in Dallas, Texas, and all of a sudden the child, like our most recent rescue, the child is now in Las Vegas, those police departments didn't used to communicate with one another. So you start over, and the traffickers knew this, and that's why Not Forgotten and some of the other huge sting operations that happened in the recent history were very successful because departments could communicate and funding was appropriated for it.
What's the status of that communication as we speak?
At the moment, it's broken down. And it's all about funding. It's going to be a directive because it's federal, right? So you got federal agencies, the U.S. Marshal Service, and then the FBI domestically, and then you got local sheriff's departments, task forces. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of anti-trafficking task forces. These are law enforcement individuals with a specific training towards how to profile and rescue a child. A lot of task forces have been shutting down. We just lost our vice unit in Dallas, Texas, shut down completely. So, and that's part of the Defund the Police movement. And sadly, in the Defund the Police movement, the first community that suffered, honestly, was those abused sexually, because those are very specific departments, normally very small, 5-6 members in a unit, and it's special funding. And when that funding is cut, they're back into a different department. And now all of a sudden you have a huge burden that shifts back on the non-government organizations without the necessary law enforcement resources. So it's a chain, and if you break a link in the chain, it's broken. I mean, we can't as an NGO go arrest people. We can't go through doors and rescue a child without a warrant. You have to work with law enforcement. And then, does law enforcement have the manpower in that community? Do they have the training in that community on how to rescue a child? Do they have the victim services in the community? If there's a rescue, now what? Where does the child go? That's the largest problem, to be honest with you. It's big.
No, I mean, this is really troubling to hear. So basically, and I imagine the people, these small units, they actually have some very, very specific skills and experience. So wait, so when this defunding happens, what happens to these people?
They go back into the normal law enforcement department. So the unit get disbanded. So the anti-trafficking task force, the unit, the special response team specifically towards trafficking, which means they wake up in the morning and all they do is protect children, find children, place children, work with NGOs. Now that officer goes back and becomes a normal officer with a great caseload that could range from drug to traffic stops to all, domestic violence, disturbance, all the other things, and physically don't have the manpower and the time to build these cases, because once we recognize a child is missing, or even more difficult, more important, when it's a familial trafficking situation, which is the fastest rising trend, family members trafficking their own children. Now the child is not missing. The child's not lost, Jan. The child lives at home, but it's trafficked. The child's on the soccer team, but it's being trafficked. That's deep investigation. It needs manpower and finance. So that's why I'm saying non-government organizations such as our own and many others do the brunt of that work, and then kind of hand the baton in partnership to a law enforcement organization. But to ask law enforcement today in our country to do that job, they're understaffed, they're underfunded. The units just don't exist.
You know, I want to go back to the police for a sec, but something you just said made me a little ill, which is this idea that there's this traffic happening within families. So you're aware and working on cases like this?
Most of our cases today are familial trafficking. Now, it's not always a father, but it is a familiar member, a coach, a teacher. You know, it could be someone in the clergy, a pastor, a priest, but it's someone very close to the family, someone the family trusts. This is psychologically, in the world of pedophilia, there's graduating forms of pedophilia, and there's a stage a pedophile reaches where they want to perpetrate and harm a child in public. They want to harm a child in the open. It's kind of a bravado of saying, I can traffic children, I can harm them in front of your face, right? And you don't know it. So they befriend family members, or this is a father. Most of them are fathers, to be honest with you. And it's for financial gain. It's because they get hooked on porn. It graduates radically into buying sex from an adult. And it's a drug. And then they go younger and younger. And so unfortunately, the fastest rising trend of trafficking in our country, Jan, is familial. 100%.
Yeah, and I don't even know how to respond to this.
And it's the most difficult to fight. You can imagine. I mean, because when it's a kid that's running away, and also most of the runaways, most of the foster children are being trafficked, don't have family members that are looking for them. They're already destitute. Now, the kid that is kidnapped, and that's 2% of the situation is kidnapping, so this is not Taken. This is real life, the movie Taken. 2% are kidnappings. But let's say there's a child that's kidnapped or taken by a trafficker, right? Still, there may be somebody looking for that child. When it's a child that's trafficked by a family member, it's concealed. It's hidden. You know, and so when an authority figure sexually abuses a child, it's very different than when it's a stranger. Because when it's an authority figure, it's a different kind of imprinting. There's a whole different kind of trauma that sets into that child, because now it's like the person I would run to defend me is the one harming me. I got nowhere to go.
So tell me a little bit about the reality around trafficking at the border then.
For me, the border issue is not a political issue. I'm just going to talk about children. We have to understand the last 50 miles on the Mexican side of the border is 100% controlled by the cartels. There's massive pressure on families to release children. The promise of a child having a future in America. That most of the children, by the time they get to the border, they've already been sexually exploited. There's already been an indoctrination, not even our side of the border. Not to mention that it's almost impossible to rescue a child or fight for a child that's being trafficked in America that doesn't have a social security number. There's not a birth certificate. It's a ghost. We're looking for ghosts, and we're finding them in Maine, in Chicago, kids who don't have family members. But let's go one step further. We talk about, over 80% of the people, the human beings that are coming across the border at the moment, 180,000 arguably in the most recent months, are young men under the age of 20, okay? Adolescents. We know that MS-13 recruits at 12. Okay? We know that at the age of 15, the boys are trafficking girls in Mexico City, kidnapping capital of the world. So we're now, by default, no question, also allowing MS-13 members at age 15, 16, 17, we're finding, entering the country under the guise of, well, where's your humanity? Well, wait a second. We got to pause. We got to make sure at the border that they're not affiliated with a gang that traffics children, that they're not actually the groomer and the trafficker themselves. Well, Jaco, come on, that's ridiculous. They're 17. The gang recruits at 12. The gang trains them at 13. They start trafficking children at 15. So the real conversation, Jan, is not being had in our culture today about, hey, what is the danger to American youth with an open border? Let's have that conversation. Let's not talk about policy and trade, okay, and the taxation on the healthcare system and all the other things. I just want to have the conversation about the child that comes over that's now in your child's school. What's that mindset that's migrated in? Or the child that's 17 that was the trafficker in Mexico, that was complicit in Mexico. So does that mean it's every child? Of course not. But it means we have to proof and verify. We have to be able to see, because we are now apprehending youth in the country who are part of trafficking rings, who are the traffickers, the abusers, who are here undocumented, right? It's just a fact. Is it all of them? No, but it's enough to say, whoa, caution, red flag. We got to stem the tide here, right? It's 100% the occurrence on the border at the moment, and that's why I'm for a controlled border. To protect that child, not even the American child, but the child that's being lied to, lured to the border, who's from Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico City, wherever, right? That child is in danger. So I'm saying this publicly, and this is me. Shame on the Mexican president for not having a policy to protect his own nation's children. And on his side of the border, because they're being exploited and sold like cattle, sold like slaves, sold like objects by some parents who have the hope that they have the American dream. Right, but what's the reality? That child shows up in America, right? Do you know, when you cross the Texas border, you're in the desert. You're a very long way from a civilization that can actually help that child. When we have members of our administration make a promise to the world that when a child crosses the border, we guarantee them a safe family, I quote, right? That's a lie. How can I prove that? Our own foster children aren't safe in this country. Our own foster children are being sexually exploited. 60% of American foster children has had a sexual encounter against their will. We're having a hard time protecting our own children, but we're going to promise the world that bring your children and we can keep them safe. It's a lie. We can't. We don't have the resources.
And so when it comes to these, just what kind of numbers are we talking about that you're aware of these, children that have basically been turned into traffickers?
Our number is 30% of children that cross the border. 30% will be sexually exploited. Am I saying all 30% will be in a perpetual cycle of sex trafficking? It's impossible to know that number. Nobody knows that number. But about 30% is our number that we work on as NGOs. 30% of their children that cross the border, at some point very soon after they cross, if not prior to crossing, will be sexually exploited. And a sexually exploited child one time is so vulnerable, Jan, to a predator. All right, so the number, who knows that real number? I mean, and we're in this drinking from a fire hose ourselves real time. We've never seen 180,000 people approach the border in a 90-day cycle, with 80% of them men under the age of 21. We don't even know. We won't know for the next 5 years what that does to a society and a culture. We're learning day by day, but I can tell you what we're seeing on the ground, it's not good. It's terrible. And it's under false pretense and false promise.